Hello and welcome back to another episode of Wise Words Book Summaries. Today we are doing another habit book. I think this is maybe the sixth one on the trot, and I've got to say I'm getting a bit sick of habits. Not sure about you, Jess.
This isn't the last one either, is it? Is it the last one?
I think we got one more after this, and then we're done. Okay. And then we're kind of weaning ourselves off it. But yeah, so today, sorry,
we're just addicted to habits, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's a habit. So today we are doing The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. This has a bit of a different structure to most of the other books. It does have a bit of like an actionable step towards the end of the book, but it kind of explains habits using multiple stories or multiple like real world examples, which is I quite enjoyed actually. It made it very easy to read. It was kind of like you're just reading a bunch of stories, and then it was able to sum up how habits work. So yeah, I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was good. It kind of talks about it on like a neurological level and then like a societal level, and so it gives you that kind of different perspective of how habits can be used in different areas of life.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking this is the book that kind of inspired some of the other ones? Like I swear to God, like Atomic Habits references.
I think so, yeah. Because this was written in 2012, and I think Atomic Habits was it 2018 or 2016?
It was definitely more recent. I'm pretty sure on that.
And this guy isn't actually like a neuroscientist or anything like that. He's a writer. He's an author or journalist. But he kind of went into these fields and was talking about people who, had benefited from a lot of implementing habits. So it was quite interesting.
Well, he's more of one of the classic sort of like popularizer of like the sort of scientific research, right? He kind of goes in, reads the research, takes away the sort of conveys some of the research more clearly in a way that's easy to understand. And I want to say, at least for me, it was the first time I was introduced to habit loop when I read this book.
Okay, yeah.
I think, at least I believe he was the one who first instigated it. And then obviously I think James Clear might have built on it and added an extra one.
He kind of added that extra step, didn't he?
Because they all have different ones as well. I was just trying to think which book was it with the investment part? I know, in fact, I'm thinking of Hooked now because part of the Hooked reward cycle, he has the investment phase.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show they're all very linked. Because I'm pretty sure Hooked has very similar sort of, cue, reward, etc. They all have the sort of similar aspects, similar words to describe the same thing.
Like it's interesting because I'm doing my dissertation around habits, so I've read a bit of the literature around it, and there is a difference. There is a remarkable difference between the neuroscience understanding of habits and the behavioral understanding. So I think the behavioral is more like what a lot of what we've been reading around, right? Whereas like in neuroscience aspect, there are three, right? There's a cue, an action, and a reward. And there aren't these other aspects, but other people have found that on a behavioral level, it's easier to conceptualize it if you like add, for instance, I think is response the other one that James Clear introduced to make it like a 4-step.
Make it easy, make it obvious.
Make it attractive.
Make it attractive. That's the reward. And then what's the last one again?
Make it satisfying.
Because make it attractive is kind of like a reward, but the same satisfying is more the reward, and make it attractive is more convincing yourself of why to do it.
Yeah.
But maybe that's more of like the response area, like is you can choose a response because you're making it more attractive to respond in a more positive way.
Yeah. But it is, I just found it quite interesting, the kind of like the difference. But yeah, so, a lot of these books, they always overlap, but normally you can get something new out of them. So should we just get into it?
Yeah, let's go. So part 1, the habits of individuals, and starting with a habit loop. So how habits work. More than 40% of the actions people performed every day weren't actual decisions, but habits. As habits start to unfold, the grey matter allocated to it is free to chase other thoughts. Our brains like to conserve energy. However, too much energy conservation would make us victims of our own laziness. To overcome this issue, the basal ganglia has devised a system where they decide when to let habits take over. And as you said, this is more sort of like the actual reasons for why habits sort of exist. The whole purpose of, not thinking about doing tasks, which we've covered the sort of similar topic to this in the other habit books, but this one seems to dive a bit more into that.
Yeah, I thought this book was introduced it very well in terms of framing habits as an earlier kind of evolutionary evolved kind of mechanism. As in, think about like animals do shit, right? And they don't have like a choice. They're like constantly just acting on impulse or instinct. And habits are kind of like that for us, right? It's just we've evolved to be able to think about things and make like rational decisions. But actually, he goes into talk about how the basal ganglia is this area of our brain that is quite close to like the kind of brainstem. And if you think about your brain like this, it's evolved over time. And the areas that are at like near the brainstem are the ones that control all the like automatic processes. So like breathing and sleeping and things like that. And so if you think about it, the basal ganglia, if it's responsible for like holding habits or controlling habits, then it's kind of like that automatic behavior. And then over time, we would have developed this ability to think more abstractly about things and detach ourselves and not have to follow through with it. But it's just interesting to think that habits were kind of like
they're like the most primitive, right? So it's
absolutely.
I can't remember if it was exactly this book, but there was an argument to be said that, obviously, as the brain gets sort of more to the sort of exteriors of the brain, that's the most recently developed areas, right? And therefore, obviously, like you're saying, the most primitive part's the most central. And that, some animals literally don't have, what's the word, like, I guess, I don't really know how you prove it, but like they lack consciousness in the sense they can reflect on actions, and they're more of just like stimulus response, if that kind of makes sense. Like you do like a specific stimulus to an animal and it will just respond in a very specific way. Because if you think about it, that's technically what a habit really is. And then I guess the prefrontal sort of area where we can actually reflect on the actions we've taken is how we actually go back and do like a top down sort of, oh, we had this stimulus, we acted this way. Is there any way we can stop or like prevent that or change that, if that makes sense?
Exactly. There's like almost different levels of like conscious response. And you have a reflex where like, you prick your finger or like, you touch a flame and you like jump back. And then like one step above that, that's where like habits are, that like kind of automatic default behavior. And even just like in that point there where it says, our brains like to conserve energy. Well, it's not binary, like it either switches off or switches on. There's got to be another stage in there. And that's that kind of default, that habitual behavior that we can like fall back on. And that's what our brains developed so that we can, when we want, and we want to use energy, we can think about something rationally and be like, okay, no, this is probably better. This is a better decision. But most of the time, and like, it says 40% of our day or our actions are like made up of habits, but actually a lot of other studies have said even higher. Some going up to like 70%. So just shows you how important it is.
Well, I think a lot of it as well is like, you have like a specific objective you want, let's just say is make lunch, and you've got a very specific routine you usually do if you make the same lunch again and again. It makes sense that if you're going to repeat that same action that you think less, right? It's kind of like automatic. Like it's like, I'm going to eat lunch, or I guess for some people it's just like, I'm going to buy lunch. And then I don't know about you, but I always stick to very similar. When I buy my own lunches, if it's like in a supermarket, I always stick to the very similar ones. And I don't know why. And I guess it is part of this like energy conservation where it's like
so much.
It's just like, I know where the ham and cheese sandwiches are.
Yeah.
Like I want a ham and cheese sandwich because that's what I like, a ham and cheese sandwich, but I know where they are. So therefore it's even less effort to even contemplate it. I've already decided ham and cheese, it's done. I know where it is. Bang.
Yeah. Done. You like it. That's it's comfortable. Habitual. Yeah, like absolutely.
The habit comes after in my head, the decision, but the decision in itself is almost habitual because it's like you don't even consider alternatives. You're like, I'm hungry, I'm going to the shop. Okay, let's just follow the normal routine. I'm going to get my sandwich and go.
Absolutely.
I would assume most people are very similar to me in that sense, and they probably get the same sandwich or the same sort of snack accompaniment. They do as meal deals or whatever.
Yeah, I reckon a lot of our kind of behavior is based on state, isn't it? It's like, oh, your body's now hungry, which elicits a thought, which elicits a habit, which is all part of the habit, right? Like the thought could be encapsulated with like the action. It triggers that thought of food, and that food is linked to ham and cheese sandwich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because I was going to say, I was saying to Alex the other day that I have weird food eating habits as well, because I would classify these as habits as well, depending on where I am. So like when I'm in England, because obviously there's different options, I have different eating habits, which always follow like a rough same. I'm constrained in my choices, let's put it that way, and I'm the same here.
Yeah.
And it's just weird that to think of it, although I feel like I'm making decisions, my decisions are literally habitual in the sense that I don't really consider alternatives. I'm just like, it's almost like I've already pre-decided, but I convince myself that I haven't pre-decided, if that makes sense. I'm like, I'm hungry. And then I immediately think straight away to, like, let's just say while I'm here, I'm thinking porridge or something like that. And because you could even argue decision-making in some sense is habitual.
Oh, absolutely.
Repeated. Well, I guess, of course it is, because I guess decision-making, let's just say if you're going to, I don't know, if you're a smoker, I guess, or if you drink, you decide to drink in a weird way, but the decision's almost already made for you by the cue. The cue gives it to you, which could be hunger or could be like a desire to do it, and then the decision's almost made. It's just you then follow it without even thinking, I guess.
Well, exactly, and it's only when we do things for the first time, right, that our brains pay loads of attention, because it needs to try and map that context, right? It's like, okay, what's going on here, so that if this situation ever comes up again in the future, then it has a kind of anchor to fall back on. And I reckon a lot of our decisions are exactly that. It's like, loads of people going outside for a smoke, I'm going to join, so that next time when they go out for a smoke, it's like, I'll have a smoke. As in it starts to just almost become that baseline thought, right? Because we're not overthinking it. It's just it's there. That's what's going to happen.
Move on? Sorry. No. I was just going to refer back to sort of the similar thing we talked about on the other podcast, which is, it's not even just knowing how to do an action, it's also knowing where to do the action. So for example, with the smoking, knowing where the smokers meet, obviously helps you, or knowing where the coffee machine is to make a coffee. If you don't know where the coffee, let's just say you start a new job, you're going to drink less coffee until you know where the coffee machine is. And once you do, you do it. It's the same with the gym. Once you know where the gym is, you're probably going to end up doing more workouts. But if you haven't decided on the gym and know where to go, you can't even do the action that you need to.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's because it's almost like we're just on autopilot all the time, but based on our brains trying to map how we're going to act in a context, but our environments are always changing. So it's almost like our conscious mind is just there.
Changing, but I think personally, it's probably this. I would assume it's the same for some people, and I think that this is a personality difference. I try and control as much of my environment to make it same as possible, so I have to think less. So, like I said, I eat lots of porridge, let's just say. I do that almost as I know it's like a healthy alternative for a snack, and it's something I can just rely on and not think. So whenever I'm hungry in the house and I'm thinking I'm going to snack, it's I'll have a porridge. But that's the reason for it, if that makes sense. I'm trying to control some elements of my life to make it easier and so I don't have to think, if that makes sense.
No, but that's it. And even just relating it to the stand chaos and order, we're trying to make everything order, but you can't possibly do that because there will always be chaos. For example, today it's snowing, right? So I have to put on a bigger jacket, right, when I go outside. And it's almost that's why we have consciousness to a degree, because we could technically keep acting in the same way every single day, because that's it. But also hello, Alex.
She's gone.
But we do need that conscious response to changes in our environment, right?
Of course. No, that is probably the argument for it, in terms of being able to bring in new context, new changes, and being able to sort of process them, if that makes sense, in a way that you can adapt. I think it reminds me a bit of the Peterson thing, where it's we do want order as much as possible, but it's always good to have some changes, and changes allow you to sort of change, but also at the same time allow you to rethink maybe some of the things you were already doing before and change your habits, in my head.
Because you have to kind of strive for more, right? If we're programmed to reproduce and pass down our genes and survive, but also survival is partly based rooted in status, then we have to have something that makes us strive for more. And it's almost like that novelty seeking, that variability. We can't just do the same thing every day, day in, day in, day out, because we get bored.
I think it's a mix, isn't it? It's like we want to have order, we want to keep stuff the same, but at the same time we do want to like change.
Have this deep embedded urge.
It's a bit. It reminds me a bit of the shattered assumption stuff, where it's like, do you know what? We actually do like having a bit of change in our daily routines, but it's just not too much change, right? Like, because when you have too much change, like you're saying, when stuff, you don't know how to react, you're then using your brain too much, and you get overloaded, you get stressed, and it's always much better to like have a few decisions every day that are maybe related to change, rather than the whole day, which is why. I remember there was, I don't know where I'm quoting this from, but like time seems to pass, I think, slower, or you process time slower in a completely new environment until you're used to it. So obviously, if you're in the same environment again and again and again. So for example, obviously now I'm based in Paris. I'm in the apartment most days, working from home. So my days mold like into one. Like my days fly by because it's a very similar environment every day.
Yeah.
But when you go, let's just say, on a holiday and you've never been to the place, your brain opens up because it has to process all this new stimulus.
Yeah.
Like you have to find your bearings again. You have to like figure out what to do. Yeah. Your experience of time slows down, and it seems like you spent a longer time there.
No, absolutely. There's more stimuli to process, all this kind of stuff that like, and this goes on to the next point right here, like of mapping your context, right? So it says here, to use habits as a default, the brain must first be sure they are reliable to fall back on, right? And so to do that, it maps the context and like the cue of that habit, and then they can extract that pattern that can be used to perform it. So our brain is just constantly trying to soak in any novelty, anything new, so that if it knows it's most of the time it's going to resort to some habitual behavior, well, you want to make sure that it knows how to deal with it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that would make perfect sense that if you're in some new environment, you're going to be process time much slower. Should
we move into the 3-step loop?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the process, or the process with this within our brains, is a 3-step loop. So first there is a cue, a trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use. Then there is the routine, which can be physical, mental, or emotional. I guess you can also say the routine here is also like the decision. Like you can routinely make decisions, I guess. Finally, there is a reward, which helps your brain figure out if this particular loop is worth remembering for the future. And then the cue and reward become intertwined over time until a powerful sense of anticipation and craving emerges. And that is essentially, that's how cravings come about. It's associating a specific cue or context with a specific, pleasurable reward. Most of the time, I would assume most of the time it's pleasurable. Whether it's, biochemical change through like, I guess, ingestion of drugs or, caffeine, etc., stuff like that. Or a reward through, I guess, social rewards or financial rewards as well. And then our decision making can be guided by our habits. So unless you deliberately fight a habit, the pattern will unfold automatically. And I thought this bit's quite interesting as well. Obviously, habits never really disappear, so they're encoded into the structures of our brains, which is great, as you don't need to relearn things. However, the problem is that our brain can't tell the difference between good and bad habits, so the bad ones remain. And that is quite interesting, because I've heard you speak about this quite a few times on the last couple of podcasts with the sort of, the neurology of it, how, they're burned into your brain essentially. Yeah. And that, the more you go down the pathway, the stronger it gets. And that, these pathways aren't just, removed. They always kind of exist there, just waiting to be reused at some point. And obviously, the more you do it, the more likely it is to be reused at some point.
Absolutely. And that's why it's like, it's interesting how, because obviously the aim is then to overlap that bad habit, right, with a good habit.
Yeah. I was just thinking like a highway, isn't it? It's like a highway, and then it's just trying to create like sort of side paths off it. And then hoping to make that side path wider and wider and wider until eventually the side path's wider than the main highway, let's just call it like that.
Exactly. And like kind of what I got from this book is that it was kind of interesting. It was talking about, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but because there's a cue, routine, and reward, that you basically take out the routine, which is, let's say in this case, a bad habit, right? And you replace another routine, which can be triggered by the same cue and is linked to that same reward, right? It still gives you that reward. And it's just about finding that routine that you can substitute. So in this case, obviously this probably doesn't work. It's probably not a direct link to the neurology, but essentially if you have a pathway and that's already been there, then you're kind of overlapping that bad routine with a good one, so that it's still there, but like you're not getting rid of it, but it's just being overpowered by this good habit or routine.
It's almost creating like an alternative route, like there's a pathway here, but you're creating like a sub branch, and then hopefully over time you can make the sub branch the main pathway.
Exactly.
I'm probably sure it doesn't work exactly like that, but it's a useful way of thinking of it.
But it is interesting if it, no, it is. Anyway, yes, so they don't really disappear, which is interesting.
Did you want to continue next?
Yeah, okay, so did you read the rest of it? Yeah, so they're encoded in the structures of our brains. So the areas of our brains that control our automatic behaviors, such as breathing and swallowing, are found close to the brainstem. So what I was saying earlier, the basal ganglia are one of these, and they are central to recalling patterns and acting on them. So an example, a study using rats found that as they learned to navigate a maze, their mental activity decreased, which is quite interesting because it's just saying, and it's interesting when you conceptualize brain imaging, right? Or brain activity, because you'd think, well, the more you do something, then maybe the more active it is. But, it can also, you learn better, right? The more you do something, the better you get at it. And so not as much activity is required to do the same thing. And in this case, that's what it's referring to. These rats would navigate this maze and they got better at it. And so their activity decreased. So as the route became more and more automatic, each rat started to think less and less. They found that this repeated activity relied upon the basal ganglia. So the brain converts a sequence of actions into an automatic routine, and this is known as chunking. And it's at the root of how habits form. I think we've talked about chunking in terms of like information, right?
Yeah,
in terms of learning. But this is kind of more like action based. I guess it doesn't have to be action based. I guess it's
but like habits are based upon like specific chunkings of like activity. Let's say the habit is going to the gym. There's a chunking part of it which is like preparing yourself through like getting changed. There's a part of it which is like getting to the gym. So you can argue that habits can be chunked down as well, like just like cooking. If you have a habit of cooking specific things, you probably chunk down the activity. So let's just say if it was like eggs, crack eggs, whisk them,
exactly.
Plan ready. Like there's like chunks of that, which is like, it's weird to think, but you're like me even speaking it now, I've already chunked it down into specific activities. It's not just like one long, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. It's interesting. It's the first time I've kind of come across the term chunking in regard to habits. But
do you know what? Yeah, we should actually probably add this to our sort of habit like formation thing, or the new habit formation. Like how can you possibly, like, if you want to do this habit, how can you chunk it down into like the parts? If it's meditate, how can you chunk meditating down? Like, upload, if you're going to use an application, open application, sit down, cross your legs.
Well, it's interesting. I think we've just been using different kind of language to describe, because we said like how to scale a habit up or down, right? So as in like, we used to talk about, if you're trying to go to the gym, then start small and be like, just put your gym clothes on, right? Even if you don't go, at least that's one step. And then later on, it's like you get in the cab to go to the gym, and then you walk through the doors at the gym, and all these different bits. But like essentially, it is the same thing. It's just different kind of language. So the next bit, so a patient who contracted viral encephalitis, which is this kind of virus that destroys multiple areas of the brain, incurred severe brain damage and to multiple areas except for the basal ganglia, which basically suggested that, it showed that memory and reason are at the root of how we behave. So this was quite like it was a really interesting study or case study. And this guy basically, his areas of his memory were kind of depleted away, right? And going back to how I was talking about how the brain kind of evolves, its basal ganglia is still there. So it's still operating, right? It can still record habits and process habits, but you're not aware of the process. So imagine, like, you start going to the gym because you want to go to the gym, you want to get big, but you can't remember why you're going to the gym. And that was kind of his thing. So he would do all these habits, right? There would be a cue and he would do his habit, but he doesn't know why he's doing it, right? Because he doesn't have these other areas of the brain that are
seriousness. Like, what are you doing? So I don't know.
Yeah, it's crazy. So they were talking about how he would have like 4 breakfasts because he'd wake up out of bed and then he'd go and make breakfast, and he'd like didn't remember why he did it, so he would do it again and then again.
It's funny you say that, because like a weird sort of side, like dementia. There was a woman in the village, which I live in the UK, who would like turn up on a Friday evening, like in her pajamas, and be like, "I'm going shopping for breakfast." But it's like, she's obviously, like, once again, like in this sort of state, she's following a routine. Yeah, that makes sense. Although at least she has more conscious awareness in the sense that she believes she's getting breakfast. But it just goes to show that, like, that is kind of like you just follow a pattern of behavior. Like, I'm wearing this, I'm going to get breakfast. It's just,
it's really interesting, but it also just shows how much we're on autopilot, right?
Yeah, no,
all someone needs to do is just
But you're on autopilot, even though there's like stimulus that can like tell you otherwise. You're kind of still on the same path. Like reality sometimes can't even inform you that you're doing the wrong path. You're on the path, right? You're doing the thing without even though people are telling you like you shouldn't be doing this thing, you still be doing it because it's like it's patterned into you. It's crazy.
Exactly. That was kind of like one of his main examples in the book. So due to his basal ganglia remaining intact, the patient was able to show that although we may not remember the experiences that create our habits, once they are lodged within our brains, they influence how we act, often without realization. It's exactly what we were just saying. Although cues can be almost anything, from a visual trigger, a time of day, an emotion, a sequence of thoughts, or the company of particular people, when presented outside of that context of the habit loop, they can make no sense at all. And I think they were like testing that. They were like giving him things that would trigger him normally, but in a different context that he just didn't know how to react with them, which was just quite interesting. So habits are surprisingly delicate. The slightest change in a cue can lead to a habit falling apart. However, the more they are used, the stronger they become, to the point where sometimes they can override our common sense. And that's, a lot of the time we work on default. And like you were saying earlier on, sometimes we do need to try and find a better solution. Maybe our habit isn't the best solution and we just keep going on with it. And a lot of the time we're not even aware that we're doing this habit, right?
Yeah.
When someone's stressed, they bite their nails. There's probably a much better way to deal with stress than biting your nails. But that's just one that we've adopted. So the last bit here. So even small shifts can end the pattern. But since we often don't recognize these habit loops as they grow, we are blind to our ability to control them. By learning to observe the cues and rewards, though, we can change the routines. So basically once you understand and deconstruct the idea of a habit, then you can start pulling apart bits and improving upon them.
Yes. So next we got the craving brain, how to create new habits. So cravings are what make cues and rewards work. It is what powers the habit loop. The more a habit is practiced, the stronger it becomes, leading to an anticipation of reward. In other words, the cue that was once responsible for just the performance of an action becomes associated with the reward, thus leading to a craving. When the cue binds with certain rewards, a subconscious craving emerges in the brain, which starts the habit loop spinning. Essentially, a habit acquires momentum when the cue, routine, and reward cultivate a craving. A cue and reward are not enough to make a new habit automatic. There must be an expected reward, a craving for endorphins, or a sense of accomplishment. This is like an interesting point there. Like, this is the part where they sort of say that habits sort of almost take on a mind of their own, so to speak. Is when you finally get this sort of synthesis where the reward and the cue become one, and then that creates a craving for the specific action. Where the action itself is the craving, is the reward almost.
Exactly. And it's it's interesting that, like, because I was listening to that Andrew Huberman talk about habits, and he was talking about there's this paper that was saying that learning a particular habit, I can't remember what it was, I think it was walking after dinner, And some people, learned it within 18 days, and some people learned it within like 258. And it's interesting that, if you apply this kind of idea of the craving, right? So you bind the cue with the reward, right? Your brain has figured out, okay, after I eat, that's the cue. I go for a walk, and then I feel, like I've digested my food. And it's just interesting that I guess for some people, maybe the reward and the cue bind a bit slower than others to create that craving, to create that momentum to go and do it again. But eventually it does. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. So next we have, if the expected reward does not arrive, the craving will grow until we either experience frustration at the fact we didn't actualize our craving, or we follow through with the habit. We have to feel like we're performing an action for a reason. A reward does this by acting as a means of completing the loop. Whether the reward has a logical connection to the action doesn't matter, just as long as it provides a positive success/completion.
Yeah,
I quite like these points here are quite interesting, because this is very similar to what Rory Sutherland sort of says about his like marketing and stuff. He talks about how like, it's more signaling than actually stuff being achieved. So Febreze have built into their product the idea of, having a scent. So like once you've cleaned the room, you spray it with Febreze, and therefore it smells nicer. And the whole point there is to sort of give you this sense of completion, because, let's just say you clean something without something that's scented. There probably won't be obviously the room will look cleaner, but there's no sort of like sensation within your body that it's cleaner. But by spraying Febreze, you get the sensation of the nicer smell, and therefore it signals to your body like I've cleaned, it's complete, it's good. I thought it was quite an interesting point, because basically the argument that Rory Sutherland was making as well was like, what these people at Febreze realized was, by adding the scent, they could sell more, because people got more not addicted to cleaning, but they were more likely to clean with this end sort of product. And it's quite interesting.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the habit loop, right, you need something to close that loop. And if you just do the action, then there's like a delayed response. Like, well, why did you do the action? You need a reason, or you need, and it doesn't, like it says here, it doesn't need to be logical.
Response when you're doing the action, you need something that signals to you that is working as well. That you're, absolutely. Because you've got exactly what I was just saying here. Consumers need some signal that the product is working. So like you've got here as well the note about the toothpaste, which is like the tingling sensation, like doesn't do anything to clean your teeth. The whole point is it's there to sort of signal to you that the toothpaste is working. You could argue, right, that the toothpaste might not work at all, but because they give you that tingling sensation. It actually reminds me, there was a book, I think it's Bad Science by Ben Goldacre, something like that. He argues the same about there was a lot of products out there which I can't remember what they're like alternative medicine products, and part of it was you ingest something and then it goes black, and the whole point is it's meant to tell you the toxins in your system, but it turns out they don't detect toxins. It's just the moment it goes in your mouth or whatever, it goes black anyway. The whole point is to give you a visual representation that you have toxins in you. So it's all like theatrics rather than actually like it working. It's the same for the toothpaste, and I thought that's really interesting that they created a sensation to convince your body that something's working. And this is like the same thing with that's how it links to habits. It's like convincing yourself that something you've done is you've achieved something through a sensation rather than just mental, because we can't all trick ourselves into like being addicted to things. I can't trick myself into being addicted to like the thought of going to the gym, right? Because it's hard.
But you trick yourself into thinking that this reward is signaling that whatever action you've done is complete, right? And which is just it's really interesting, because you could apply that to so many different things, and whether there's even a link there, right? Whether it's even linked to the like the toothpaste example, whether it's even linked to the action or what you're trying to do. It's just super interesting. I think so many people probably apply that, and it doesn't actually make anything better.
Literally, it does make me worry a little bit, because it's quite easy to trick, let's put it that way.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, so then the last point on that is just cravings are what drive habits, and figuring out how to spark a craving makes creating a new habit easier. Because just think about it, it's just creating that momentum. Once you bind that cue with the reward, then when that cue triggers you, then you start to think about the reward. It's that expectation, that dopamine surge. Yeah. So next bit is the golden rule of habit change, why transformation occurs. So champions don't do extraordinary things. They do ordinary things, but they do them without thinking, too fast for the other team to react. And this, I think, was a quote from a guy Tony Dungy, who coached an American football team. So Dungy, whether I'm pronouncing his name right, I don't know, Dungy, believed it was easier to convince someone to adopt a new behavior if there was something familiar at the beginning and end. So, emphasis on the familiar, because like we were saying at the very beginning, like we like comfort, we like familiarity, but we also like a bit of variability now and then. So by keeping the old cue and the old reward, you can shift the routine and change the habit. So an example would be vaping. So a smoker usually can't quit unless they find some activity to replace cigarettes when their nicotine craving is triggered. So in this case, a lot of people switch to vaping because it does exactly the same thing, right? You get that nicotine rush. Still,
but you could also remove the nicotine potentially as well.
You could,
so you can do the the action. You almost have the same action, same cue.
Absolutely. Well, think about like
maybe
decaf,
less of a reward technically, but no, but like it doesn't. But arguably, it's not less of a reward to a degree because a lot of it is based upon the actual action as well. So a bit like you're saying with the decaf, it's a bit like non-alcoholic beers. I think we spoke about this before. Where let's just say you have a craving for a beer. Non-alcoholic beers tend to actually, remove the craving, even though they don't have alcohol in it. So therefore, the relationship isn't necessarily with the alcohol substance itself. It's more with the the action almost.
Absolutely. And when we talk about reward, we're not talking about incentives here. We're not talking about a reward like 30 minutes later, because your brain won't bind that reward to that cue. It's too late. There's too much of a gap. A reward is something that happens within like the first few seconds. As we're going around that loop, our brain is like literally has a couple of seconds looking for something to signal that we have completed that loop, right? And that's what the reward is. So the golden rule of habit change is if we keep the same cue and the same reward, a new routine can be inserted. Okay, so one that the cue can still trigger that new action or that new routine, and the reward is linked to that routine, right? When you do that action, you get the same reward. So Alcoholics Anonymous does this by helping alcoholics identify the cues and rewards that encourage their alcoholic habits, and then helping them find new behaviors they can use instead, which makes a lot of sense. Like you kind of, because, a lot of the reason why we do certain habits is because we want that change in state, right?
Yeah.
And so if we can still get that state, but by doing something a bit healthier, then that's the fucking goal. Awareness training is a method of asking patients to describe what triggers their habitual behavior so they can recognize their cues. And we've talked about this in terms of going through your day for like a week and trying to write down all the behaviors that you do, and then trying to identify all the cues.
Right, what preceded that behavior.
Exactly. Because once you do that, then it's like, okay, well, I'm going to substitute that with this. I'm going to substitute eating that with an apple, so it's just once again, it's different language.
Because I was going to say that's literally how what you just said there with the substituting of an apple. If you removing or like going away from the alcohol stuff, if let's say you have a sugar craving, I'm hungry, I fancy some chocolate. Like you just said, it's keep the same craving, which is I'm hungry, I fancy sugar. Add in an apple, which still contains sugar, but it's meant to be better for you. Like it has more nutritional content than chocolate, and you still get the same reward, which is the sugar high. It's just replacing those previous habits with stuff that which fits the bill, does exactly the same thing, but just in a better way.
Yeah. And I think I remember having this thought when I was reading the book is I reckon you could eventually wean yourself off it by, okay, let's say you have a chocolate bar, which has a certain amount of sugar in it. It's quite like an abstract idea, but, and then you were to have swap that with a different chocolate bar which has less sugar in it, right? So the reward is slightly different, and then you know, almost wean yourself off it towards a much lower amount of sugar until it can be replaced with something else, and then something else, until you kind of like, you've completely shifted that cue and that reward, the association between the cue and the reward, to something that fits a kind of ideal behavior, if you get what I mean. Yeah, because technically, right, like the cue will trigger the expectation of the reward, and at the moment it's like some sugar rush, right? But if you can slowly change the relationship between the cue and the reward to something which is a lot lower sugar, rush.
You know, so I guess in a weird way, so like let's just say you start off, right? So you obviously got the sugar craving, you eat chocolate. And you know that's like an unhealthy way to do it. You then start going, I'm craving sugar. You then eat an apple. You obviously hit the sugar rush craving, but you're also starting to identify, like create an identification that's like, I'm choosing health.
Yeah.
Does that get what I mean? Like, I'm hungry, I'm choosing health. There's almost like a subtext to it. Then if you repeat it enough times, eventually you might even be able to be like, right, I'm choosing health here, but an apple still doesn't solve my problem. I'm going to choose health in the sense of I'm going to have a carrot.
Yeah.
Even less sugar. Do you kind of get what I mean?
No, exactly.
You're building up this identity that, you know, you have this craving of hunger / craving sugar, but you've changed the meaning of what you do. Beforehand, it's like, I'm hungry for sugar. I'm going to eat chocolate. I'm going to, you know, do the thing to, you know, I just want sugar. Then you're starting to slowly identify that actually what I'm trying to do here is trying to be healthy. And then health becomes the actual reason for it. And therefore the choice that then eventually changes in my head to the carrot. Like the evolution happens, if that makes sense. That's how I would see it going.
Yeah, I think that's bringing the identity thing makes sense.
You know, because you ask yourself a little bit of the reason. I don't know. That's how I ask myself, at least when I'm craving something. I mean, there's plenty of times I use the, you know, as we said before in the habit blueprint, the moral licensing or whatever, where it's like, I've eaten healthy today. Screw it, I'm gonna have some chocolate. But I'm usually like, I don't find myself doing that every day. But it's funny that a lot of my choices now as well, because I've programmed myself over time about the sort of healthy alternatives where I'm just like, I'm hungry, I'm gonna have a porridge. Like I've said this many times now, but like I think the reason why that transition happened is when I'm even debating what to eat, the first thing that comes into my mind first now is like, what's the healthiest alternative here?
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? Like I'm thinking differently about the same cue, which I think happens over time once you start changing the routine. And then you start, I guess, realizing, why am I even changing this routine? It's because I want to be healthier. And then that helps guide you in the future. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's interesting.
It's like, you know, vaping as well. I vape, so I'm going to stop smoking. I'm going to vape with nicotine. I'm going to reduce my nicotine over time because eventually the end goal is to be healthier. So to get to the point eventually where you're just vaping, you know, the non-nicotine. And then eventually, hopefully at some point, you can switch to maybe even like coffee or something. I'm going to stand outside with the people who smoke and have a coffee, or I'm going to do something else.
No, exactly. And it kind of links to the whole Atomic Habits when he talks about, you know, cues are relationships. It's your relationship with your environment, right? And as you change your identity, those relationships also change, right? It's almost like a top-down system that then affects how you perceive the reward and what actions you will use to get to that reward. I think you could definitely start to wean yourself off and change. You know, as you change, you can change the actions that you do.
I think a lot of it, funny enough, actually is this idea of changing the identity, but changing the goal of the behavior. Because I think a lot of us just do the behaviors because of the, like we're saying, the reward, like the pleasurable feeling.
Yeah.
But we need to move away from we need to make sure we can try and hit the same pleasurable feeling, but with an alternative which achieves another goal. Yeah. So if the pleasurable feeling is causing you health implications, find a healthy alternative. And then over time, I genuinely do believe you start transitioning to like, I actually care about health a lot. I now identify somebody who makes healthy choices. Yeah. And then you'll further be able to explore the health path, I think.
Exactly.
I don't think it's one of those things you just do immediately, right? Like you just go, I'm going to absolutely wean off completely, like no more chocolate. And then you hope the cravings subsist, but they don't. You need to find a way to slowly replace it.
I think there's a lot more motivation if it is rooted in a goal. I think a lot of the actions that we do are based on in the moment change of state, right? As in like, I'm bored, I want to use my phone. and there's no goal there, so there's nothing to motivate me
No,
not
you're right.
to do
No,
that,
exactly that.
right?
Yes, no, agreed. Okay, yeah.
If I want to be someone who's a bit more productive and I start applying that, big abstract goal to a lot of the actions that I do, then it changes how I perceive that action now. It's like now when I pick up my phone, it's like, oh, actually there's an added element that makes me want to not do that, right?
This is negative, yeah. Like this is not a behavior I want to do. Yeah.
Exactly. So it is about applying that kind of goal that you want, whether that is an identity shift or whether that is just a goal that you want, like a physical goal. Then yeah, I think when you apply that to an action, then it changes how you perceive it. So then moving on. So the idea is to choose new routines that provide similar payoffs. It is not the routine you crave, it is the reward. The routine is just something you have resorted to getting the reward. Although habit replacement has been shown to be very effective, it tends to fail when stressful life events occur. Academics have found that belief in one's ability to change plays a major role in overcoming this hurdle. Belief is the ingredient that makes a reworked habit loop into a permanent behavior. And I thought this was very interesting because he was talking a lot about Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was saying that there's almost a spiritual element, and a lot of scientists and academics don't like the idea of spirituality because it's something they can't define. But really what they boiled it down to was belief. If you have belief that you can carry something on, then when you are hit with like a hard time, then you're able to overcome it because you have that belief that gives you that motivation. Whereas if that's not there and you're just purely going on, changing the routine, then it doesn't hold up. And then they were saying,
it makes sense. A lot of like, that sort of like negative self-talk when somebody's like, I can't stop smoking. I can't do this. I can't like. You're right. They've almost like given away the belief and they've let the sort of behavior control them. You know what I mean? There has to be an element of like, I can beat this. I am capable of, overcoming it. Because I feel like that's the bit when you get into that sort of part of despair. Because I feel like we're talking here from a perspective where we're actively trying to implement habits and we are achieving some level of a success with it. So we have proven belief to ourselves that we can do it. Whereas some people who might listen might literally be in that camp of, I've tried everything and I can't. Yeah. And that's where like you're saying here, a bit of spirituality, a bit of communal groups of all people supporting each other, being like, actually, you can do this. Yeah. I'm proof. It's quite interesting. That's where like role models come in, right? It's like, you see somebody who's managed to achieve what you want. And it's like, oh, I now believe I can do it because this person's done it. And
it's the same thing with like, even with the book Influence with similarity. If we see someone who's similar to us, who may be in the same kind of situation, them doing something, then it gives us motivation because we're like, okay, if that's possible, then I believe I can do it. And like you just said, you commented about the group idea, and that plays a huge role in this. They were saying that people might be skeptical about the ability to change if they're by themselves, but a group will convince them to suspend that disbelief. A community such as Alcoholics Anonymous creates belief. When people join groups where change seems possible, the potential for that change to occur becomes more real and believable. And I think that is so key because it, like, once again, there's an element of accountability, but actually this book kind of introduced the idea of belief and how important it is. Because think about, alcoholics are an extreme case, same with like people who, substance abuse, but essentially they might have tried to stop by themselves numerous times, and then something hits them, life hits them, and they resort back to their old ways, which is perfectly understandable. And so that belief is like worn down over time. It's like, well, I've tried numerous times and then this happened and that happened, I can't do it. But if you have everyone else who's like, look, I was in the same situation, I believe you can do it, like you just need to do it like this, blah blah. It gives you much more motivation, as well as the accountability.
It does make sense. Like you said, if you can have somebody who's literally like a bunch of people are all in the same boat, and then some of them have achieved, it does remind you that anything's kind of possible. Yeah, right. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who've been defeated by their own sort of by themselves again and again and again.
Absolutely.
And I think the worst thing is there's always a battle because you can defeat yourself, right? Yeah, and you can defeat yourself for a couple of months. And then you revert back, right? Like the whole sort of New Year's resolution, sort of, people stick to it for a month and then you fall back. So like you can prove you can make a change, but then it's sustaining a change, which is the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting. So yeah, just a summary on that. So the golden rule of habit change is that by keeping the same cue and the same reward, a new routine can be inserted. However, for a habit to stay changed, people must believe change is possible, which is dramatically improved when commitment to change occurs as part of the group. Yeah, I liked that chapter. I thought that was good.
Yeah, no, it's a good chapter. Some stuff kind of that we've like covered before in terms of group motivation stuff, but at the same time, it felt different when we were talking through it.
Yeah.
So now we got, because this book actually, which is interesting to note, is obviously about habits, but it also brings in a lot about organizational habits, like how to manage people and have their habits, right?
Yeah.
I'm wrong to think that.
Yeah.
So part 2, the habits of successful organizations, and we're going to start with here the Keystone habits. So which habits matter most. And to be fair, this was covered, I believe, by James Clear in Atomic Habits, and this is probably where he took it from. But some habits have the power to start a chain reaction, changing other habits in their path. When these habits shift, they dislodge and remake other patterns. So Keystone habits start a process that over time transforms everything. The idea is that success is not dependent on getting one single thing right, but instead relies on identifying a few key priorities and fashioning them into powerful levers. So when tackling things, try to get to the bottom of the issue and find out what the new habit routine is that could make all the difference, like ripples that end up affecting the whole system. So, I mean, we can rattle out a few here immediately. I would say, we spoke lots about sleep, I think.
Yeah.
The whole idea of getting to a habit of having good amounts of sleep is going to benefit all areas of your life, for example. So you get more sleep, you can have more energy, you're going to be better rested, you're going to be able to have the willpower to pursue other habits, right? So this is kind of the point he's making here, where it's like, if you pursue certain habits, they're going to impact a lot of other habits and the motivation for it.
Exactly.
Another one being fitness as well, right? Like fitness, health, anything which sort of benefits, your ability to think, your ability to move, etc.
And it all starts with you may start that little Keystone habit, but then the abstracted kind of goal, right, can then be applied elsewhere, right? Because you realize, it may be context specific in this particular domain. So I think he gave an example in this, which was quite good. It was like people who were told to just write down what they were eating, right? Just that one little thing. So it's very specific. It's like, this is how much I'm eating a day. And then you start to spot the patterns, right? And then it's like, I eat when I'm like this, or I'm eating too much. And then what you end up doing is starting to apply that elsewhere and tracking other things, right? So tracking how many steps you do a day. And so you could see how that kind of first, it was context specific, but now you can start applying it elsewhere. And it's like that that rippling effect. It's like rippling outwards and affecting loads of other areas because you've learnt the tool and now you can apply that tool elsewhere. I thought, like Keystone habits are just a must.
If it's one of the first things you can do after listening to this podcast, it'd be one of the first things to focus on. So like you said, detecting Keystone habits means looking for certain characteristics. Keystone habits offer what is known within our academic literature as small wins. They help other habits flourish by creating new structures, and they establish cultures where change becomes contagious. Small wins do not combine in a neat linear serial form, with each step being a demonstrable step closer to some predetermined goal. More common is the circumstance where small wins are scattered, like miniature experiments that test implicit theories about resistance and opportunity, and uncover both resources and barriers that were invisible before the situation was stirred up. So Keystone habits encourage change in 3 ways. 1, by offering small wins. 2, by creating structures that help other habits flourish. And 3, by creating cultures where new values become ingrained. Keystone habits transform us by creating cultures that make clear the values that in the heat of a difficult decision or a moment of uncertainty we might otherwise forget.
I think it's just interesting once again, like especially what it was saying, that it doesn't occur in a linear fashion, and that I could have a cold shower in the morning and then that could keep me a bit more like awake and alert. And so when I go into uni and I'm in my lecture, I'm much more curious and I start to ask a lot more questions. It's all like very simple
and
things.
It's not like 1 extra second in the shower equals 1 extra second of curiosity.
Exactly.
And that's what he means by the linear sort of
Absolutely.
More exponential potentially, if that makes sense.
But yeah, no, it is very interesting. And it's like, you may not see a relationship. You may not think of like, okay, if I do this, it's going to change that, right? But then actually, once you kind of like look at the abstract aspect of it, you can. So there was like an example here, and it was to do with like an organization, and this guy came in, and it was like, some big, I think it was like a smelting company, and it was quite interesting. This guy came in, I think he was from the army or something, and he was like, we're going to focus on health and safety. And everyone was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, all these like big cats were there, and they were just expecting to talk about like profit. And they were like, no, we're talking about health and safety. This is key, right? I don't want anyone, because there's smelting companies all like warehouses all over the world apparently, and people die and stuff like that. And so they were like, we're focusing on this. And so he created this Keystone habit. So here it says, so if anything happened on site, they had to contact this guy who's the new CEO within 24 hours. But to do that, that means that everyone had to improve their communication with one another, right? So you can already see how that's starting to ripple outwards. It's starting to affect the chain of command, the communication aspect. And so that meant that, the vice president would talk to the managers, and the managers would talk to all the employees, and the employees would all have to talk to each other. And so already it started to improve how everyone communicated. And all they're really doing is that they have to like tell someone within 24 hours if there was a safety issue, which it just shows that you may not think like, oh, why would safety like have an impact on communication? But it did. And then, profits soared. It's just interesting.
It can happen both ways. I was going to say, you could open up a channel of communication and get bombarded with absolute shit. So
that's true.
So no, but it's
maybe it reveals all the shit that's going on.
True. That's also true.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on. So next chapter was willpower becomes automatic. So dozens of studies show that willpower is the single most important keystone habit for individual success. However, willpower isn't just a skill. It is a muscle like any other, and it tires if it is worked too hard. And I thought this was interesting because in a lot of the other habit books, they kind of tell you to not go near willpower. You shouldn't be reliant on it whatsoever because it's like a muscle, right? Because it wears out. And this book was kind of saying, well, okay, it is a muscle, but actually it does help you get over a lot of hurdles, but you need to treat it with care and focus on the right things. So the next point was, if you want to do something that requires willpower, like going for a run after work, you need to conserve your willpower rather than use it up on tedious tasks throughout the day. So self-discipline predicted academic performance more robustly than did IQ. Self-discipline also predicted which students would improve their grades over the course of the school year, whereas IQ did not. Self-discipline has a bigger effect on academic performance than does intellectual talent. And I guess this is just suggesting that, it is important to control design your environment so you don't have to rely on willpower. But for those things where that you kind of want to overcome that hurdle, build up that baseline, really embed it as a habit.
It's a tool that can be used and should be used when needed.
And so being self-disciplined with how you use your willpower and what you're going to apply it to is really important. I thought that was just quite an interesting point. As people strengthen their willpower muscles in one part of their lives, the strength tends to spill over into other areas. So exactly what we were talking about with keystone habits. People get better at regulating their impulses. They learn how to distract themselves from temptations. And once you've gotten into the willpower groove, your brain has practice at helping you focus on a goal. Willpower becomes a habit by anticipating the painful moments in a behavior's routine and then coming up with ways to overcome that hurdle. I think that's quite important. And once again, we talked about this a lot in terms of planning for failure. I think we talked about this was it the now habit?
Yes, it was, yeah.
If you know that a hurdle is going to pop up and it's going to require willpower, then maybe try and design it so that, the hurdle, design your environment, or use these other habit techniques that we talked about to reduce that hurdle. But then if there is still something to overcome, then, you're going to use your willpower for that.
Yeah. I try and what am I going to try and say? I try to think of willpower as just more like energy levels, to be honest. I find my willpower is depleted when my brain energy levels are low, such as, you've spent a long day maybe thinking, but thinking to make lots of decisions, there's classic examples of Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, who were the same things every day. So they have to make less decisions so they conserve their energy. And I believe it's one and the same personally. I find willpower is intrinsically linked with my own mental energy.
Oh, absolutely.
Depending on how much I've used throughout the day. So I almost try and rephrase willpower more to be like decision energy, maybe, or motivation energy, or because it's technically that's what it is, right? Will, like the will to do something, the motivation to do something is the power of your motivation that you can muster up.
Absolutely.
But it's definitely, I don't know if I agree with this whole statement that it's a muscle either, to be honest. I think it's more of just like a gauge. I'd almost say it is like a gauge, and if it goes down too far during the day, you're going to be able to use less of it. Maybe you can replenish it. You can replenish it through napping. I think a nap will probably help you replenish it.
Absolutely.
But I'm convinced it almost confuses people, I think, the word willpower, when it really is just like energy, to be honest.
Yeah, I just think of it as like cognitive energy.
Exactly. If you're, and there must be biohacks and tips and tricks for energy. That'd be quite an interesting thing to go into, actually.
Yeah.
The biomechanics, or the biohacking of motivation, let's just call it, or cognitive energy.
Yeah.
How to replenish it. I would assume the best thing to do would be a nap, genuinely, but I can think there must be other things that could probably help.
Well, think about improving your metabolism by doing fitness, right? So even when you're not doing fitness, if you have a higher level of metabolism, then it's burning energy and you have more energy, right? It's burning fat and all those things. So creating energy for you to attribute to whatever task you're doing. But yeah, there are definitely ways of increasing your energy levels, which in this case is just used interchangeably with willpower. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, next we have... Wait, sorry, have I gone too far? No. So we've got how leaders create habits through accident and design. Just as choosing the right keystone habits can create amazing change, the wrong ones can create disasters. Destructive organizational habits can be found within hundreds of industries and at thousands of firms, and almost always they are the products of thoughtlessness of leaders who avoid thinking about the culture and so let it develop without guidance. Every organization has institutional habits, but only some of them are deliberately designed, while a majority are created without forethought. A lot of the time, these habits grow from individual employees' rivalries and fears. It may seem like most organizations make rational choices based on deliberate decision-making, but that's not really how companies operate at all. Instead, firms are guided by long-held organizational habits and routines that often emerge through thousands of employees' independent decisions. If thousands of employees are all acting in response to their own habits, then there is bound to be conflict. An organization can design routines that act as a means of bringing all employees in line with the same habits. This can reduce conflict as well as create a truce between potentially warring groups of individuals within an organization. Creating successful organizations isn't just a matter of balancing authority. For an organization to work, leaders must cultivate habits that both create real and balanced peace and paradoxically make it absolutely clear who's in charge. During a crisis, people are much more open to change, meaning organizational habits become malleable enough to both assign responsibility and create a more equitable balance of power.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just because, for instance, what we were talking about in the first chapter, how habits can define our decisions, right? And so here it's saying, you may think that companies, or organizations make rational choices, but think about it, like rational decision making. Okay, well, let's just say decision making. Well, if our decisions can be impacted by our habits, then if we don't have the right habits in place, then the decisions that we're making, that we think we're consciously making but are actually influenced by our habits, may be really shit, right? And especially if there's no kind of structure or routines in place that kind of encapsulate
or enforcements of structure, enforcing a structure, enforcing a behavior. So I finished recently that book on corruption. Remember Corruptible? And he made this really interesting point about, so I want to say it was parking, and it might have been in London. and it was something to do with diplomats and foreign diplomats coming and parking in London and getting parking tickets. And there was this like system where diplomats could like, because they have like a fake address, they have like an address which doesn't belong in the UK. They'd receive loads of bills and they never had to pay them. And because they weren't being enforced, like these bills, diplomats were coming to the UK and just parking everywhere and racking up loads of fines, right? And the moment they started enforcing it, the whole behavior changed. And his whole point being like, if you have rules and then you don't enforce them or find a way to enforce them, people will take the piss. And he's like, the irony of this is like, these people aren't actually like bad people. Not necessarily. Like, we're talking from people from corrupt countries and people from non-corrupt countries, all behaving like this when it wasn't being enforced. And it's the same thing in a business. If you're not enforcing the specific like standards you want, and then the habits in the company are like, oh, it's not being enforced, we can do what we want, and everybody behaves like that. Then in the end, the company's going to be dysfunctional. And that happens way more than people think, I would say.
You're breeding negative habits. Essentially, you need to create structure, create a routine where everyone is kind of in line and adopting the same habits, so that then there's coherency, right? And that's what he was kind of talking about with the rivalries. It's quite specific to like organizations and industries or a work context. But the fact is that if you aren't all adopting the same kind of rules and habits, then there's going to be conflict. If you're doing what you want to do, then it's going to go against some person eventually. And so it's just important to adopt organizational habits. And then also, and like you said, and then also make sure they're being followed, and like in a weird way setting punishments, so to speak. Or I like the point here he made even better, which is assign responsibility. So like it's not even really punishing. Well, it is punishing, but it's like, this is what you're responsible for. Do it. And if you don't, there will be consequences. But also, it's like, exactly. If everyone is like adopting the same habits, then they know that someone else is also acting in a similar way, right? There is an expectation there, rather than if you have your own individual expectation of someone, and obviously they're not abiding by the same rules that you are, then there is going to be conflict.
There's a habit of people not being held accountable in an organization. Like, let's just say the higher ups don't have a habit of making sure they're checking in on people and keeping them accountable to their responsibilities. They won't do the responsibilities because they're not being held accountable. They'll be like, oh, this person's like kind of checking in on me, but they're not really. So I'm not going to do the thing I said I was going to do, because why should I? Like, I've never once been told off for not doing what I'm meant to be doing, even though that's what my job's going to be paid for.
Exactly. And their brain is literally saying that like the reward is that I can get away with this and no one's doing
but it's not even malicious, really.
No, it's not. It's just,
I used to think it was like people taking the piss, but actually a lot of it's just like they're not really they're just doing what any normal human does, is kind of like, this is my responsibilities, but at the same time they're signaling to me that these responsibilities don't matter by not checking in on me. So why should I, treat these, if they don't treat it as like urgent, why should I treat it as urgent, sort of thing?
Yeah. And think about it from like a competitive perspective. So okay, let's say you have some integrity and you want to uphold a system, right? But then no one is trying to enforce that system. So you may be cutting your nose off by, abiding by the rules, but no one else is. And so they're constantly beating you. It's abstract, but whatever the task is. And so eventually you will succumb to it, because you can't keep up with all these other people that are taking advantage of the system, because the system isn't being enforced, right? It's not being put in place. There's no accountability. Whereas if it is, then everyone will start to. There will be ones that always try and find that loophole, that way to take advantage of it. But
of course,
that's always going to be the case. It's human nature.
But yes. The very last bit on this. So a company with dysfunctional habits can't turn around simply because a leader orders it. Rather, wise executives seek out moments of crisis or create the perception of crisis and cultivate the sense that something must change until everyone is finally ready to overhaul the patterns they live with each day. And you've got here the note about the shock doctrine, and that's pretty much exactly what that book was talking about, which is like the discovery that, crises create change. And therefore, if you can manufacture crises in other countries, you can basically manipulate economies and take over, essentially. But that's a conversation for another day.
Well, that may be a bit malicious, but yes, in this case, like, if you want to create,
but once again, it's malicious in the sense that it's the idealism, isn't it? It's the classic, this is for the greater good. Like, more harm has been done because of the greater good than anything else in this world. Like, literally everything that's ever been justified to do evil is always, this is the greater good.
Well, it's I think it was also saying, was it in Good Habits, Bad Habits, when they were talking about displacement? Like, if, for instance, when you move house, it's like the best time to start new habits because you haven't got relationships to your context yet, right?
Yeah,
to your
relationships,
environment.
the cues. Yeah,
exactly. So the same thing goes with, like, when there's a crisis and there's a complete change of behavior, then people can be like, okay, we're going to start adopting this. This is the habits that we're going to put in place to create a bit of structure. So yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so moving on, I didn't have much for this chapter, but when companies predict and manipulate habits. So humans like comfort and conserve energy. However, they also desire novelty and variability, which we talked about earlier on. Dressing something new, like a new habit, in old clothes can make it seem more attractive. So we can do this by stacking a new behavior or habit between two familiar habits. So it gives both a sense of comfort and novelty. So an example was in this chapter, it was talking about the song Hey Ya, like by Outkast. And they were saying that it was like, it's a smash hit, but it was too novel. It wasn't like any song at the time. And so actually not many people were listening to it, even though people were saying it's a great song, because it was just too unfamiliar. So what they started doing was putting in a familiar song beforehand and then putting Hey Ya and then putting another familiar song after. So it's kind of bracketed in familiarity, but there's also that novelty, that new variability. And so people would love the song. And so to market a new habit, be it groceries or aerobics or whatnot, you must understand how to make the novel seem familiar. And we see that all the time. It's just rebranding, isn't it? It's like selling the same product again, but just reframing it, giving it a new, description or whatnot. Like, it's fucking politicians do it all the time. But yeah.
I thought that's quite an interesting thing about the Hey Ya.
Yeah, I know.
Uncommon knowledge.
Yeah, really, it is funny.
Cool.
So
we have now on to part 3, so the habits of societies. This chapter is called How Movement Happens. So social habits are why some initiatives become world-changing movements, while others fail to ignite. The reason why social habits have such influence is at the root of many movements is a 3-part process. So the first part is a movement starts because of the social habits of friendship and the strong ties between close acquaintances. Number 2, it grows because of the habits of a community and the weak ties that hold neighborhoods and clans together. And 3, it endures because a movement's leaders give participants new habits that create a fresh sense of identity and a feeling of ownership. Usually only when all 3 parts of this process are fulfilled can a movement become self-propelling and reach a critical mass. You have some notes here on the difference between strong ties and weak ties. So strong ties exist between close-knit members with frequent interactions, such as family and close friends. Weak ties are the links that connect people who have acquaintances in common, who share membership in social networks, but aren't directly connected by strong ties of friendship themselves.
It really is. Like, I think Liam recommended me a book actually talking about how.
Yes, the networking, wasn't it? It was like a networking book, right?
I think so. Yeah,
because I saw it. Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, I had it to my list. It looks good. It's like how to leverage like friends of friends or something, wasn't it? It was something.
Yeah. Because those, I think the idea is that our strong ties, we're in the same situations, the same context, so we kind of know what they all know, right, to a degree. Whereas like weak ties, you don't know that much about how much they know, right? And so they can influence ideas and things like that because there isn't. I
was also going to say, in a weird way as well, they won't be forgiven as well for mistakes, in a sense that they would be more likely to impress you as well, because like you've been recommended for a friend and it looks bad on your friend if you behave weird.
Yeah.
Whereas friends are more likely to let you down in the sense because they will not let you down, but they just know you're friends. So it's just like I'm not going to come tonight because of this excuse, and you're just going to be like, yeah, fair enough, because you're my friend. I'll let it slide. But then somebody else, a friend who like stands you up at something, it's going to be a bit more, not awkward, but you kind of know what I mean. I feel like there's stronger motivation involved to hold dates.
Yeah. Exactly.
As
we want to put our best self forward.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, that's interesting.
Okay. Right, what's next? Okay, sorry. When sociologists have examined how opinions move through communities, how gossip spreads, or political movements start, they've discovered a common pattern. Our weak tie acquaintances are often as influential, if not more, than our close tie friends. Most people don't care enough to protest against something unless one of their strong ties has been negatively effective. However, peer pressure is often used by activists as a tool to compel people to protest by encouraging them to conform to group expectations. And also in this day and age, peer pressure via labeling but like if you don't believe in this, you are a Nazi. It's such a classic default response these days. It's actually it reduces the effectiveness of Nazism, or like the label of it, because it's just like, you don't agree with me, well, you're a Nazi. It's like, oh fuck, okay.
Think about COVID. It's like, if you don't abide by this rule, then you're killing people. And it's like, do you want to kill your community? It's just like, it's leveraging those weak ties, isn't it? It's like, it's leveraging how much like we pride our reputation and our status, and it's pitting that against us. It's like, if you don't do this, well, then you're not considered someone in our society, or you are a citizen in our community.
So peer pressure habits often differ in form and expression from person to person, and aren't so much one consistent pattern, but dozens of individual habits that ultimately cause everyone to move in the same direction. However, they have been observed to spread in a similar fashion through weak ties, and they gain their authority through communal expectations. And then the third aspect of how social habits drive movements works by getting an idea to grow beyond the community. It must become self-propelling by giving people new habits that help them figure out where to go on their own, and giving people an identity to embody. And with it, they will start acting and participating in habits that reflect that identity. I heard you thinking of something to say then about the shared authority through communal expectations.
I was just I was just saying that so this chapter referred to Rosa Parks, who was this woman during the I'm going to push this, I want to say 50s, might be 60s, with Martin Luther King and the protests about civil rights. And it was just talking about she how the movement kind of began, and then Martin Luther kind of became their leader and gave them this new identity to take on board, almost these social habits, how to interact with people, which kind of made this whole movement self-propelling, because you're giving people who are oppressed in this case, a new identity. And if everyone else also knows that they have that identity, then it kind of becomes self-propelling, right? Because you know that people are engaging in the same activities that you are. And it got to that point by, leveraging strong and weak ties, because they were saying that, for instance, Rosa Parks had a lot of strong ties, but she also had a lot of she was known within the community. And I think, I can't remember, I'm probably butchering this, I can't remember if she was a cleaner, but she had a lot of friends in a lot of different contexts within the community that don't normally talk to each other. And so that kind of also helped this, propulsion of this movement. And it was just quite interesting, like how it described these three kind of parts of building a social movement played a part. I just thought it was quite interesting.
The identity part is quite interesting.
Yeah.
But I find it really interesting when the identity becomes like, especially in this day and age, where the identity for some movements is like, truth. Like, we embody truth. We embody. Yeah. It's a bit. You can't
argue against it, can you?
Because once you embody something which is like, can never be challenged. Like you said, that can never be challenged.
Yeah.
Therefore, anybody challenges you as an enemy. It's like, Jesus, okay.
Yeah. That's ridiculous.
That's a one-way ticket to war. But anyway.
Okay, so the next bit is next chapter is the neurology of free will. Are we responsible for our habits? I didn't have too much for this chapter. It's quite straightforward, but basically, habits are so neurologically ingrained that studies show they can occur with almost no input from the higher regions of the brain. Some thinkers, Aristotle wrote in his Ethics, hold that it is by nature that people become good. Others that it is by habit, and others that it is by instruction. For Aristotle, habits reign supreme. So he thought habits were the things contributing to it. William James, who is the father of psychology, famously wrote that the will to believe is the most important ingredient in creating belief in change. And one of the most important methods for creating that belief was habits. So we've talked about this a lot, actually, just in terms of like having evidence for your identity that you want to become, right? That you have that ideal person. Committing to those habits gives you evidence of you becoming that person, those votes towards that ideal type. And yeah, so it's just, if you, and touching on what we talked about earlier on in terms of belief, if you believe you can change and you have that goal and you're committing to those habits, then that kind of, all of those should help, you achieve that identity.
Am I right to think this chapter as well, maybe it was a different book, but it included a lot about the sort of the neuroscience of sort of like addiction? Am I wrong in this chapter? There's a lot about addiction.
Good habits, bad habits.
Okay, maybe it was that. Okay.
But yeah, probably we'll talk about that in terms of free will and things like that.
No worries. So we're into the sort of the summary then, the overall sort of a reader's guide to using these ideas. So was this taken direct, or was this just like built upon the ideas within the book?
This was taken direct. Like I picked notes, but specific notes, but yeah.
So yeah, we got the framework for creating better habits. It's a 4-step process. So step 1, identify the routine. Once you've diagnosed the habit loop of a particular behavior, you can look for the ways to supplant old vices with new routines, such as what we said earlier, where it's, you're eating chocolate. Let's just say, let's replace it with banana for now.
Yeah.
So the routine is the most obvious aspect. It's the behavior you want to change. You then need to identify the cue and reward for this routine. I don't know if you want to do step 2. We'll take it in turns.
Yep. So step 2 is experiment with the rewards. So to figure out which cravings are driving particular habits, experiment with different rewards. The point is to test different hypotheses to determine which craving is driving your routine, because sometimes we don't always know why we're doing a behavior. We just do it. I assume I'm bored, so I pick up my phone. So an example would be, are you craving the cookie itself or a break from work? If it's not the cookie, is it because you're hungry, right?
Exactly. Are you hungry? You're just bored.
Exactly.
Classic, are you bored eating? Because that happens to a lot of people. Like, I'm bored. I just,
and it's interesting that we have to interpret our own behavior or the reasons why for our behavior, because we just do it so automatically all the time.
Yeah. It's just like there's a mild sense of uncomfort, and you're like, what can I solve this uncomfort with? Whether it's checking your phone, snacking on sugar, whatever it is. Yeah.
Exactly. So as you test 4 or 5 different rewards, look for patterns by jotting down the first 3 things that come to mind. So an example is, they can be emotions, random thoughts, reflections on how you're feeling, or just the first 3 words that pop into your mind. Then it says you should set an alarm on your watch or computer for 15 minutes. And when it goes off, ask yourself, do you still feel that urge? So essentially, you're experimenting to try and find the reason why you do this action. Why do you do this action? Why, and what is the specific reward that completes it, in a sense. So then if 15 minutes after receiving a reward, you still feel the urge to seek out a different reward, then your habit isn't motivated by the reward you think it is. Once you've figured out the routine and the reward, what remains is identifying the cue. So exactly what we've kind of touched on, obviously not in the most practical sense, but essentially you're just trying to identify that reward so you can figure out what you can supplant the routine.
Yeah, of course. And then we've got here step 3, so isolate the cue. The reason why it's so hard to identify the cues that trigger our habits is that there is too much information bombarding us as our behaviors unfold. I'd say you've got to start with identifying the categories of behaviors ahead of time to scrutinize in order to see patterns. Almost all habitual cues fit into one of 5 categories: 1, location; 2, time; 3, emotional states; 4, other people; and 5, immediately preceding action. Example, so if you're trying to figure out the cue for the going to the cafeteria and buying a chocolate chip cookie habit, you write down the 5 things in the moment the urge hits. So where are you? Could be sitting at your desk. What time is it? 3:36 p.m. What's your emotional state? Bored. Who else is around? No one. And then what actions preceded the urge? Answered an email. And you continue this day after day to identify the patterns.
Yeah. I thought that was a particularly cool kind of,
Yeah.
it's very straightforward, very easy to
It's a
do.
very easy framework, isn't it? Like, where are you? What time is it? What are you feeling? Is there people around you? And then, what was the last one? What action preceded it?
Yeah. So I'll definitely probably adopt that. So step 4, have a plan. So a habit is a formula our brain automatically follows. So when I see cue, I will do routine in order to get a reward. The easiest way to re-engineer the formula is to have a plan. And within psychology, these plans are known as implementation intentions, which we've talked about, I think, in numerous podcasts now. The idea of basically just stating when and where you're going to be doing it. And maybe after what action or in between what action, so that it's clear when you're going to do it. So yeah, exactly. So that was the power of habits. Did you want to go over anything else in particular?
No, I think that's it. I think it's very, once again, if you've listened to any of the other habit ones, you're probably sort of seeing a lot of recurring themes here. There's not really too much to add here that you couldn't be added by going back and listening to the other ones. So if you haven't listened to the other habit podcasts, go back and check out the Atomic Habits, the Habit Blueprint, the Now Habit. We've done them all at this point. It's
So the next one is Good Habits, Bad Habits, I think.
Yeah, okay, cool. And then we're going to move on to Hooked potentially, or was there more than just that?
I think there's Tiny Habits as well.
Okay, it's fine. We can bash through them. It's
beautiful.
It's a good time to be doing habits, right? As far as I'm concerned, New Year's coming around.
Exactly.
And that's when most people start,
absolutely
picking up habits. So
this book summary will be up tonight or today. So if you want to go and check out all the actionable steps, head on over to there. But until next week, we'll catch you then.
Yeah, catch you then. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials, as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below. Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.